Hello everyone. Today is the 13th of December 2023 and I thought about it and I decided that I'm going to do one more video on this art of cross-examination, and I'm going to take you through a hearing and a cross-examination and the actual transcript of an examination. This is a case, it's very interesting because it is a case of in 1875, and it's a case of a breach of marriage. As you can imagine, 1875, breach of marriage, of a promise to marry, is an extremely important thing. It has consequences. But also it can be used, in other words, the gentleman in question may have led the lady, down the primrose path, as Professor Mearsheimer says. And we understand because her reputation, all that is involved. At the same time, a woman who is by nature malicious, I think we are more malicious than men are, that is my okay, or we use it differently in any case, can also use that to say, oh, this millionaire here, or this banker, or this particular, he actually promised marriage to me. And it could be not true. So it can be used either way. So look at the interrogation. First of all, I am just as a preamble, I'll read from The Art of Cross-Examination, Francis L. Wellman, a book published in 1903. Okay, so he introduces the case as by saying, this is a case of Martínez versus Del Valle. So this is in New York. Del Valle is the defendant, the gentleman in question, who was a banker and very rich, and he was Cuban. And Martínez is obviously another Spanish surname. So she might have been, I don't know, perhaps Cuban or Puerto Rican or in America, as you know, everyone who speaks Spanish is said to be Spanish. But in any case, okay. So this is the introduction. One of the most brilliant trials in the annals of the New York courts was the celebrated action for breach of promise of marriage brought by Miss Eugenie Martínez against Juan del Valle. The cross-examination of the plaintiff, the lady, Martínez, in this case was conducted by the Honorable Joseph H. Coate, and is considered by lawyers who heard it as perhaps the most brilliant piece of work of the kind Mr. Coate ever did. So Mr. Coate is for the defendant, and he is going to cross-examine her, the plaintiff. The case was called for trial in the Supreme Court, New York County, before Mr. Justice Donoghue in January 1877. The plaintiff was represented by Mr. William A. Beach, and Mr. Coate appeared for the defendant, the gentleman, Mr. Del Valle. The trial lasted for a week and was the occasion of great excitement among the habitués of the courthouse. To quote from the daily press, all those who cannot find seats within the courtroom remain standing throughout the entire day in the halls with the faint hope of catching a sight of the famous plaintiff whose beauty and grace have attracted admirers by the score from every stage of society, who haunt the place regardless of inconvenience or decency. There is no more popular occasion in a courtroom than the trial of a breach of promise case, and none more interesting to a jury. Such cases always afford the greatest satisfaction to an eager public who come to witness the conflict between the lawyers and to listen to the cross-examination and speeches. With Mr. Beach, fresh from his 9 days oration in the Henry Ward Beecher case, pitted against Mr. Coates, who told the jury that this was his first venture in this region of the law, and with a really beautiful Spanish woman just 21 years of age, quote, with raven black hair and melting eyes shadowed by long graceful lashes, the complexion of a peach, and a figure ravishing to contemplate. Who is suing a rich middle-aged Cuban banker for $50,000 damages for seduction and breach of promise of marriage. The intensity of the public interest on this particular occasion can be readily imagined. It must have served as a stimulus to both counsel to put forth their grandest efforts. The plaintiff and defendant were strangers until the day when she had slipped on the ice and had fallen in front of the Gilsey house on the corner of 29th Street and Broadway. Mr. Del Valle had rushed to her assistance, had lifted her to her feet, conducted her to her room, received the permission of her mother to become her friend, and 6 months later had become the defendant in this notorious suit, which he had tried to avoid, actually, by offering the plaintiff $20,000 not to bring it into court. Mr. Coates spoke of it to the jury as an excellent illustration of the folly in these modern times of attempting to raise a fallen woman. To quote his exact words, "Now, I want to speak a word of warning to all good Samaritans, if there are any in the jury box, against this practice of going to the rescue of fallen women on the sidewalks. I do not think my client will ever do it again. I do not think anybody connected with the administration of justice in this case will ever again go to the relief of one of our fair fallen sisters under such circumstances. I know the parable of the Good Samaritan is held up as an example for Christian conduct and action to all good people, but gentlemen, it does not apply in this case, because it was a certain man who went down to Jericho and fell among thieves, and not a woman. And the Good Samaritan himself was of the same sex, and there is not a word of injunction upon any of us to go to the rescue of a person of the other sex if she slips upon the ice. Why, gentlemen, that is a historical trick of the nymphs of the pavement. Hundreds of times has it been practiced upon the verdant and inexperienced stranger in our city." End of quote. Mr. Coates felt that he had a good case, a perfectly clear case, but there was one obstacle in it which he could not overcome. There was a beautiful woman in the case against him, quote, a combination of beauty and eloquence which would outweigh any facts that might be brought before a jury. Very early in the trial, Mr. Coates warned the jury against the seductive eloquence and power of the learned counsel whom the plaintiff had enlisted in her behalf. quote, one of the veterans of our bar, of whose talents and achievements the whole profession is proud. In that branch of jurisprudence which I may call sexual litigation, he is without a peer or a rival. From his long experience, you can do no more help being swayed by his eloquence that could the rocks and the trees help following the lyre of Orpheus. When it came to Mr. Beach's turn to address the jury, he replied to this sally of Coates in this way. During the progress of this trial, counsel has seen fit to make some personal allusions to myself. It seemed to me not conceived in an entirely courteous spirit. He belabored me with compliments so extravagant and fulsome that they assumed the character of irony and satire. It is a common trick of the forum to excite expectations which the speaker knows will not be gratified, and blunt even the force of plain and simple arguments which may be addressed to the jury. The courtesy of the learned counsel requires a fitting acknowledgment, and yet I confess my utter inability to do it. I lack the language to delineate in proper colours the brilliant faculties of the learned gentleman, and I am perforce driven to borrow from others the words which describe him properly. I know no other source more likely to do the gentleman justice than the learned and accomplished friends among us taking notes. I notice a description of my learned friend so appropriate and just that I adopt the language of it. And here he read, the eloquent and witty Coates sat with his classic head erect, while over his cupid features his blue eyes shed a mild light. There was a great laughter in the courtroom at this. Allow me to tender it to you, sir. Mr. Coates smilingly accepted the newspaper clipping. And how completely does my learned friend fulfill this description? How like a god he is. There's laughter. The observed, all of us observers. Why, how can I undertake to contend with such a heaven-descended god? And so on. Okay, so Miss Martínez took the witness stand in her own behalf and told her story. I became acquainted with Juan del Valle under the following circumstances. On or about the 14th of January 1875, when passing through 29th Street near Broadway, I slipped on a piece of ice and fell on the sidewalk, badly spraining my ankle. Recovering from my bewilderment, I found myself being raised by a gentleman who called a carriage and took me home. He assisted me into the house and asked whether he might call again and see how I was getting on. I asked my mother, and she gave him permission. He called the next day and passed half or three-quarters of an hour with me, and told me he was a gentleman of character and position, a widower, and lived at 55 West 28th Street, that he was very much pleased with and impressed by me, and that he desired to become better acquainted. He then asked whether he might call in the evening and take me to the theatre. I told him that my stepfather was very particular with me and would not permit gentlemen to take me out in the evening, but that as mother had given her consent, I had no objections to his calling in the afternoon. He called 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes with his 2 younger children, and sometimes taking me to drive in the park. About 3 weeks after the beginning of our acquaintance, he told me he had become very fond of me and would like to marry me, that his wife had been dead for 3 years, and that he was alone in the world with 4 children who had no mother to care for them, and that if I could sacrifice my young life for an old man like him, he would marry me and give me a pleasant home, and that he was a gentleman of wealth, able to provide for my every want, and that if I would accept him, I should no longer be compelled either to endure the strict discipline of my stepfather or to struggle for simple existence by teaching. And he gave me the names of several residents of New York, some of whom my stepfather knew personally, of whom I might make inquiries as to his character and position. And I asked Mr. Del Valle whether he was in earnest, saying that I was comparatively poor, and since my stepfather's embarrassment in business had not mingled in society, and wondered that he should select me when there were so many other ladies who would seem more eligible to a gentleman of his wealth and position. He replied that he was in earnest, and that he had once married for wealth, but should not do so again. He told me to talk with mother and give him an answer as soon as possible. He said that he loved me from the first moment he saw me, and could not do without me. My mother gave consent, and I promised to marry him. Mr. Del Valle then took me to Delmonico's and after we had dined, we went to a jewelry store in 6th Avenue, and he selected an amethyst ring for an engagement ring, as he said. The ring was too large, and it was left there to be made smaller. 2 or 3 days afterwards, he called on me at my house, placed the ring on my finger, and said, "Keep that ring on that finger until I replace it with another." At the 3rd interview, after the presentation of the ring, Mr. Del Valle said that owing to some difficulties in his domestic affairs, which he called a compromise, he did not think it best to be married publicly, as he feared that the publication of his marriage might cause trouble. So he urged me to marry him immediately and privately. I was greatly surprised and said, "If there is any trouble, why marry at all? I hope there is nothing wrong. What is the nature of the compromise?" And he replied, "Oh, there is nothing wrong, but I have a compromise in Cuba." "And it is not convenient for you or me to marry publicly, as the person concerning might make you trouble." I told Mr. Del Valle that I would not marry him privately, and that I would release him from his engagement. A day or 2 afterwards he took me to a restaurant to dine with him, and then I gave him a letter in which I enclosed the engagement ring, and told him I would not marry him privately. This letter I sealed, asking him not to open it until after we had separated. 5 or 6 days afterward, he called again and seemed ill. He said that my letter had made him sick, and he asked, "What could induce you to write such a letter, Eugenie? You could not have loved me if you thought so much about the nonsense I told you about a compromise. The compromise is all arranged, and I want you to take back the ring and say when and where we shall be married." I said I still loved him, and if the compromise had been arranged, I would accept the ring, but would not marry him secretly. He then put the ring on my finger and said, Now I want you to tell when and where we shall get married." It was finally agreed that we should be married in the fall. From the date of this conversation, which was early in March 1875, until the 28th of April 1875, Mr. Del Valle called almost daily and took me to theaters and other places, and was received at home by all my family except my stepmother as my stepfather as my accepted suitor. He frequently complained that he could not call in the evening and wished me to live in his house in 28th Street and take charge of his children. I refused, and he then proposed to take a place in the country where the children could have plenty of air and exercise if I would go and take charge of them. And as we were to be married so soon, he wished me to get well acquainted with his children, adding that if I really loved him, I need have no doubt about his honorable intentions. I laughed at the idea, but finally consented to leave my home and go into the country with his family. As I was losing all my pupils, he insisted upon giving me $100 a month. He persuaded me there was no impropriety in his suggestion, as we were to be married, and that I should never return home excepting as his wife. I had told him that my stepfather had threatened to shoot me and any man whom I might marry. He persuaded me to leave my home at once, and as he had not yet secured a country house for the summer, I was to go to the Hotel Royal for a few days and live under an assumed name, which I did. He kept me at the hotel for 5 weeks, persuading me not to return home, and by the 1st of June he had secured a country place at Poughkeepsie, and I went there to live with him and his 4 children. His conduct toward me up to this time had always been everything that could be desired, always kind and considerate and anxious for my every comfort. Neither by word nor act did he indicate to me that his intention was any other than to make me his wife. He had engaged a very fine mansion at Poughkeepsie, overlooking the Hudson, fine grounds, and everything one could desire in a country house. Mr. Del Valle gave me the keys to the house and told me the entire establishment was under my charge. So 6 days after I arrived at Poughkeepsie, he forced his way into my bedroom. I insisted upon an immediate marriage as my right. He told me he had not been able to arrange the compromise in Cuba, and begged me to be reasonable, and he would be my life friend, that I could not return home under the circumstances, and that anything I might at any time want, he would always do for me. He tried to persuade me that I would best accept the situation as it was, and that it was a very common occurrence. I had no home to go to, and did not dare to record the circumstances to my mother. I would have died first. 3 months later, or at the end of the summer, his manner entirely changed toward me. I repeatedly asked him for some explanation. He persuaded me that his coldness was assumed to prevent the servants from talking, that he was going to Cuba to try to fix up the compromise, and prevailed upon me to go back to my home and parents and wait. This I did on the 6th of September. After I returned to New York, I wrote to him, but received no reply, and have never seen him since. Nothing could be more witty or brilliant than Mr. Coates' own description to the jury of, quote, the appearance of this fair and beautiful woman while she was giving her evidence on the witness stand. It was a part of the exhibition, he said, which no reporter had been adequate to describe. Gentlemen, have you seen since the opening of this trial one blush, one symptom of distress upon her sharp and intelligent features? Not one. There was in a critical point of her examination a breaking down or a breaking up, as I should prefer to call it. Her handkerchief was applied to her eyes. There was a loud cry for water, water from my learned friend, echoed by his worthy and amiable junior, as though the very bench itself were about to be wrapped in flames. But when the crisis was over, then it appeared that there had only been a momentary eclipse of the handkerchief, that she had been shedding dry tears all the while. Not a muscle was disturbed. She advanced in the progress of her story with sparkling eyes and radiant smile and tripping tongue, and thus continued to the end of the case. The great masters of English fiction have loved nothing better than to depict the appearance in court of these wounded and bleeding victims of seduction when they come to be arrayed before the gaze of the world. You cannot have forgotten how Walter Scott and George Eliot have portrayed them sitting through the ordeal of their trials, the very pictures of crushed and bleeding innocence, withering under the blight that had fallen upon them from heaven or risen upon them from hell, never able so much as to raise their eyes to the radiant dignity of the bench, seeming to bear mere existence as a burden and a sorrow. But, gentlemen, our future novelist, if he will listen and learn from what has been exhibited here, will have a wholly different picture to paint. He will not omit the bright and fascinating smile, the sparkling eye, the undisturbed composure from the beginning to the end of the terrible ordeal. With what zest and relish and keen enjoyment she detailed her story. What must be the condition of mind and heart of the woman who can detail such stories to such an audience as was gathered together here? Well, it will be seen that one of the great questions of fact to be disposed of in the case was whether there was a breach of any promise of marriage on the part of the defendant to the plaintiff. That being decided in the negative, everything else would disappear from the case. All other matters were simply incidental to that. The conflicting evidence could not be reconciled. One side was wholly true, the other side wholly false, and the jury were to be called upon to say where the truth was. Was there a promise of marriage 3 weeks after the plaintiff and defendant met on the corner of 29th Street and Broadway? The plaintiff had stated in substance that after 3 weeks the defendant proposed marriage and she accepted him, that he took her in a carriage to Delmonico's to lunch and took her to a jeweller's store in 6th Avenue and there purchased a ring as a binding token of the promise of marriage. That was her case. If the jury believed that, she would succeed. If they did not, her case would fail. That ring was a clincher, according to her statement of the story given on the heels of the promise of marriage. What else could it mean but to bind that bargain? This was the way the case stood when Mr. Coati rose to cross-examine Miss Martínez. There could be no better evidence of the success of the particular method of examination than Mr. Coates chose to adopt on this occasion than the comment in the New York Sun. Quote, "A vigorous cross-examination by Mr. Joseph Coates did not shake the plaintiff's testimony. Miss Martínez told her story over again, only in more detail. How poor a judge of the art of cross-examination this newspaper scribe proved himself to be. He had entirely failed to penetrate the subtlety of Mr. Coates' methods, or to realize that, in the light of the testimony that was to follow for the defense, Miss Martínez, during her ordeal, which she appeared to stand so well, had been whittled into a complete annihilation of her case, unconsciously to herself and apparently to most of those who heard her. And yet, though the audience did not realize it, Miss Martínez left the witness stand so effectually smashed that there never afterwards could be any doubt in Mr. Coates' mind as to the final outcome of the case. In his summing up, Mr. Coates made this modest reference to his cross-examination. Quote, "I briefly asked your attention to her picture as painted by herself, to her evidence and her letters, giving us her history and her career." End of quote. And then he proceeded to tear her whole case to pieces, bit by bit, in consequence of the admissions that she had unsuspectingly made during her cross-examination. We are going to hear the cross-examination, not all of it, but most of it. Quote, "And now, gentlemen," this is Mr. Coates, "with pain and sorrow I say it, has not this lady, by her own showing, by her own written and spoken evidence, and the corroborating testimony of her sister, established her character in such a way that it will live as long as the memory of this trial survives?" In starting his cross-examination, Mr. Coates proceeded to introduce the plaintiff to the jury by interrogating her with a series of short, simple questions, the answers to which elicited from the lady a detailed account of her life in New York since the year of her birth. She said she was 21 years old, was born in New York City. Her parents were French. Her own father was a wine merchant. He died when she was 7 years old. 2 years later, her mother married a Mr. Henriquez, with whom she had lived as her stepfather for the 14 years preceding the trial. She had been educated in a boarding school. Since graduation, had been employing herself as a teacher of languages, etc., etc. Mr. Coates had in his possession a letter written by the plaintiff to Mr. Del Valle during the first few weeks of their acquaintance. In this letter, Miss Martínez had complained of the wretchedness of her home life in consequence of the amorous advances made to her by her stepfather. Mr. Coates was evidently of the opinion that this letter was a hoax and had been written by Miss Martínez for the sole purpose of eliciting Mr. Del Valle's sympathy and of inducing him to allow her to come and live in his family as the governess of his children, with the idea that a proposal of marriage would naturally result from such propinquity. Who are you with so far? Okay. Suspecting that the contents of this letter were false, and judging from statements made in the plaintiff's testimony in chief that she had either forgotten all about this letter or concluded that it had been destroyed, Mr. Coates set the first trap for the plaintiff. Here is the letter first, before he starts the interrogation. Dear friend, it's signed by her, Eugenie. Dear friend, I believe I promised to write and tell you my secret. I will now do so. When I was 9 years of age, my father died. My mother married my uncle, who is not my father. To make a long story short, Papa loves me and has done everything in his power to rob me of what is dearer to me than my life, my honor. And ever since I was a little child, he has annoyed me with infamous propositions and does so still. You can easily imagine how unhappy and miserable he made me, for I don't love him the way he wishes me to, and I cannot give him what he wants, for I would sooner part with my life. I have only God to thank for my unsullied honor. He has watched over me in all my troubles, for, oh, my dear friend, I have had so many trials. But it is God's will, and I have always tried to be a good girl, and now you know my secret. My heart feels light now. I now leave you, wishing you all my sincere good wishes, and with many kisses to the dear little girls, I remain your friend, Eugenie. Okay, so this is the letter that she wrote, and this is the letter that Mr. Coates has in his hands. So, this is the beginning of interrogation. Mr. Coates, by what name did you pass after you returned home from boarding school and found your mother married to Mr. Enriquez? Miss Martínez, Eugenie Enriquez, invariably. And when did you first resume the name of Martínez? When I left the roof of Mr. Enriquez. Always until that time were you called by his name? Always. Did your father exercise any very rigid discipline over yourself and your sister that you remember? He did. When did that rigid discipline begin? It commenced when I first knew him. And it was very rigid, wasn't it? It was, very. Both over yourself and over your younger sister. Yes. Taking very strict observation and care as to your morals and your manners. Exceedingly so. How did this manifest itself? Well, in preventing my having any other associates. He thought there was no one good enough to associate with us. Then he was always very strict in keeping you in the path of duty, was he not? Most undeniably so. Was this a united family of which you were a member? Were they united in feeling? Very much so, indeed. There are very few families that are more united than we were. All fond of each other? Always. One can readily picture to himself Mr. Coates and the fair plaintiff smiling upon each other as these friendly questions were put and answered. And the plaintiff, entirely off her guard, is then asked, probably in a cooing tone of gentleness and courtesy that can be easily imagined by anyone who has ever heard Mr. Coates in court, the important question. Mr. Coates, as to your stepfather, you were all fond of him, and he of you? Very fond of him indeed, and he very fond of us. And except this matter of his rigid discipline, was he kind to you? Very. and gentle, very gentle and very kind. Considerate, very considerate always of our happiness, but he did not wish us to associate with the people by whom we were surrounded, as we were not in circumstances to live amongst our class. When was it that he first introduced the subject of marriage, or forbidding you to marry, or even thinking of marrying? Well, when I was about 16 or 17. And was it then that he said that if you married, he would shoot you and shoot any man that you married? He did. That was the one exception to his ordinary gentleness and kindness, wasn't it? Yes, the only one? The only one. Your stepfather is no longer living, is he? No, he's not. He died last October. It will be observed that Mr. Coaty did not confront the witness at this point with the letter that she had written, complaining of her father's brutal advances to her and implying the necessity of her leaving her home in consequence. Many cross-examiners would have produced the letter and would have confronted the witness on the spot with the contradiction it contained instead of saving it for the summing up. It is interesting to study the effect of such a procedure. By a production of this letter, the witness would have been immediately discredited in the eyes of the jury, yes. The full force of the contradictory letter would have been borne in upon the jury as perhaps it could not have been borne at any other time in the proceeding, and the Sun reporter could not have said the plaintiff had not been shaken. On the other hand, it would have put the witness upon her guard at the very start of a cross-examination, and she would have avoided many of the pitfalls which she confidingly stepped into later on in her testimony. All through the examination, Mr. Coaty had frequent opportunities to put the witness on her guard, but at the same time off her balance. On her guard, off her balance, which one? It is a mooted question which method is the better one to employ. It all depends upon the nature of the case and the personality of the witness. So let us continue. Had Miss Martínez been confronted with her own letter, in which she had written of her stepfather, quote, "He loves me and had done everything in his power to rob me of what is dearer to me than my life, my honor. Ever since I was a little child, he has annoyed me with infamous propositions, etc., etc." It would be difficult to imagine any way in which she could reconcile her letter and her sworn testimony, and Mr. Coaty would have had the upper hand of his witness from that time on. Furthermore, during the examination of a witness, the jury invariably form their opinion of the witness' integrity, and if that opinion is in favor of the witness, it is often too late to try to shake it in the summing up, which is what Mr. Coaty did. It is usually, therefore, the wiser course to expose the witness to the jury in his true colors during the examination, and, if possible, prejudice them against him at the outset. In such cases, oftentimes, no summing up at all is necessary, and the closing speech becomes a mere matter of form. Many lawyers save their points in order to make a brilliant summing up, but an opinion once formed by a juror is not easily changed by a speech at the end, however eloquent. This is the experience of every trial lawyer. But we see that Mr. Coaty, experienced as he was, left it. Okay, let's continue with the examination. Instead of nailing this point in the cross-examination, as Sir Charles Russell, for instance, would have done, Mr. Coatie turns quietly to the next subject of his examination, which is one of vital importance to his client and to the theory of the defense. Mr. Coatie, can you fix the date in January when you first saw the defendant, Mr. Del Valle? Miss Martínez, it was on the 15th of January. Either the 14th or the 15th. It was on a Thursday. I had an appointment with my dentist. Thursday appears by the calendar of that year to have been on the 14th of January. That was the day, yes. The supreme importance of this inquiry lies in the fact that Mr. Coatie was in possession of the account books of the jeweler from whom the alleged engagement ring had been purchased. And these records show that the ring had been bought on the 15th of January, or one day after the plaintiff and the defendant first met, and before there had been any opportunity for acquaintance or lovemaking or any suggestion or possibility of a proposition of marriage, and presentation of an engagement ring which, as the plaintiff said in her own story, had been given her with the express request that she should wear it until another ring should take its place. So Mr. Del Valle's version of the story, which the defendant, Mr. Del Valle's version of the story, listen to this, which Mr. Coatie was intending to develop later in the case, his story was that he had met the plaintiff, was pleased with her, had assisted her to her home, had met her again the following day, had suggested to her as a little memento of their acquaintance and his coming to her assistance, that she allow him to present her with a ring, and that after lunching together in a private room at Solaris, they had gone to a jeweler's and he had selected for her an amethyst ring in commemoration of the day of their meeting. It was this ring which the plaintiff later tried to convert into an engagement ring, which she claimed was given her 3 or 4 weeks after she had first met the acquaintance of Mr. Del Valle, and after he had repeatedly asked her hand in marriage. So it seems as if the day after he's just trying to impress her with his money or something. Anyway, interrogation. Mr. Coatie, what time in the day was it that you first met Mr. Del Valle on this Thursday, the 14th day of January? About 2:30 in the afternoon. Have you any means of fixing the hour of that day? Yes, I had an appointment with my dentist at 3:00. Your appointment with the dentist had been previously made, and you were on your way there? I was on my way there. It was at the corner of Broadway and 29th Street that you fell on the ice, was it not? It was. You did not observe the defendant before you fell? I did not. And you had never seen him before? I had never seen him before. Did this fall render you insensible? Very nearly so. I fell on my side and was lying down on the ground when Mr. Del Valle raised me up. I remember there were some iron railings near there, and I was leaning against these railings while Mr. Del Valle hailed a cab, assisted me into it, and took me home. He told me in the cab that he had been following me all the way up Broadway. Did he tell you for what object he followed you? He did not. He merely told me that he was following me. And you did not ask him for what purpose he followed you? I did not. Did he drive you to your home? He did, and when we arrived, he assisted me into the house. I had sprained my ankle. He explained my accident to my mother and that he had brought me home. My mother thanked him, and he asked if he might call again and see how I was getting along with my injury. The plaintiff had explained that it was the serious nature of her injury which had occasioned her allowing a stranger to get her a cab and take her home. However, the clerks in the jewelry store, where the ring was bought the day following the accident, remembered distinctly seeing the plaintiff and the defendant together in the jewelry store for over half an hour while they were selecting the ring. In order to involve the plaintiff in further difficulties and contradictions, Mr. Goethe continues in the same vein. So you were somewhat seriously disabled by your accident, were you not? I was. For how long? Well, for 2 or 3 days. Sprained ankle. My ankle hurt me very much. I had it bandaged with cold water and lay on the bed for 2 days. The 3rd day I was able to limp around the room only a little, and the 4th day I could walk around. How long was it before you got entirely over it so as to be able to go out of doors? Well, I went out the 5th day. And not before? Not before. So that because of the injuries that you sustained, you were confined to the house for 5 days. I was. And the 1st day, or January 15th, this was the day she had bought the ring, you were confined to your room and lying upon the bed? Yes, sir. I reclined upon my bed. I was not confined in bed as sick. When was the first time you were with Mr. Del Valle at any time except at your mother's house? Do you mean the first time that I went out with him? Yes. It was during the week following that in which I met him. I met him on Thursday, the 14th, and went out with him sometime during the following week. What was the place? We went to Delmonico's to dine. Was the ring the only present he gave you, or the first present? Oh, no, not by any means. When did you begin to accept presents from him? The first day I went out with him, when we went to Delmonico's, I accepted books from him. What was the book that he then presented to you? Oh, well, I forget the title of it. I think it was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And from that time he continued, when you went out with him as a general thing, giving you something? Giving me books and buying me candies. After we were through dining, he would stop at a confectioner's and buy me something. Down to the time of the first talk of marriage, which you say was about 3 weeks after you met. After that, how many times did you go with him to Delmonico's or other restaurants? Before. Well, on an average of about 2 or 3 times a week. Where else did you go besides Delmonico's? The first time I went to any place with him besides Delmonico's was at the time of the engagement, when he gave me the ring, when he bought the ring for me. Where did you go then? We went in University Place somewhere. I do not exactly know what street. What side of University Place was it? On the opposite side from Christian's bookstore. Mr. Coetti with a smile. Was it a place called Solaris? Hesitating. I think it was. How many times did you go there with him before he gave you the ring? I never went there before he gave me the ring. That was the first time I ever went to this place. How came you way down there in University Place? How came you way down there in University Place if you live up in 56th Street? Did you make an appointment to be there? He came up to the house for me. Came up and took you down there? Yes. Didn't he come up to inquire if I had accepted him as a husband, and ask me if I had consulted my mother, and ask me what answer I had for him, and had I not told him that I would marry him? It was then that he took me to this restaurant in a carriage, and after that he bought the ring for me. The same day? The very same day. Some considerable number of weeks, you say, intervened between your first acquaintance and this dinner at Solaris, this engagement and the giving of the ring. About 3 weeks, as nearly as I can fix the time. Where was this jewelry store where the ring was bought? It was on 6th Avenue. I cannot say near what street it was. I felt cold and tired that day. We walked from Solaris, and it seemed to me as though the walk was rather long. You remember the name of the store? I do not. Should you know the name if I told you? No, I never knew the name. This juror took the witness stand for the defense and testified that Miss Martínez was present on the 15th of January when the ring was bought, according to the entry made in his books, and that in consequence of the ring being too large, she had ordered it made smaller, and had returned 3 days later herself alone, had taken the ring from his hand, and had given him a letter addressed to Mr. Del Valle, asking him to deliver it when Mr. Del Valle should call to pay for the ring, although, as Mr. Coetti sarcastically put it, it had been in her fond memory as a cherished remembrance that Mr. Del Valle had put it on her finger and told her to keep it there until he replaced it with another. Who does not see, said Mr. Coetti in his summing up, that the disappearance of the ring from the case as a gift upon a promise of marriage 3 weeks after the first acquaintance carries down with it all this story of the return of the ring to the defendant and the defendant's return of it to the plaintiff? Let's continue with the examination. Coetti, did you ever go to this store but the one time? Never went there but the one time. And you are sure of that? I am very sure of that. The only time you were there was with Mr. Del Valle? That was the only time I have ever been in that store in my life. You say you looked at a solitary diamond ring. Yes, but Mr. Del Valle told me that he preferred an amethyst, and I took the amethyst. There was a considerable difference in the cost, wasn't there, between them? There was. Do you know the cost of the amethyst ring? I think it was about $45. And the cost of a solitaire diamond ring might be many hundreds of dollars. $105, $110, $115, I do not know. Did you look at any other jewelry? Mr. Del Valle asked me if I wished anything else, but I did not. Mr. Coati here deviated from his former plan of not confronting the witness with the evidence he was intended to contradict her with, and having first shown the witness the letter addressed to Mr. Del Valle, which she had left at the jeweller's on her second visit there, the handwriting of which the witness denied, Mr. Coati followed with this question. Now, let me refresh your recollection a little, Miss Martínez. Didn't this visit to the jeweler take place on the 15th of January, the day after you made the acquaintance of Mr. Del Valle? Oh, no, by any means, no, sir. Sure of that? I am very sure of it, for I was confined to my room the day after I first made the acquaintance of Mr. Del Valle. Then you never went to that jeweller's store but once? Never. I would not know the store. I do not know. I do not recollect the name of anything about it. There was some trouble about the ring being too large, wasn't there? Yes, the ring was too large for the finger I wished it for. And orders were left to have it made smaller. Yes. What arrangement was made, if any, for your getting the ring when it should be made smaller? There was no arrangement made. Mr. Del Valle merely said that when he called upon me again, he would bring it to me, and he did bring it to me. About what time was that in February? It was, I should say, the first week in February. I cannot give the exact date. Now, let me again try to refresh your memory and your recollection. Didn't you yourself go to the jewelry store and get the ring? I myself? Yes, you yourself. I never went to that jewelry store but once in my life, and that was with Mr. Del Valle himself while I selected the ring. On behalf of the defendant, Mr. Coati was intending to swear as witness a Mr. Lewis, who kept the store on 9th Avenue around the corner from where the plaintiff lived in 44th Street, and a Mrs. Crank, who lived around the corner from her residence on 56th Street, who would both testify that the plaintiff had a confirmed habit of having letters left there for her, letters from various gentlemen, some of them having the monogram F.H., the initials of Frederick Hammond, the clerk of the Hotel Royal. Mr. Coati also had in his possession a letter of the 22nd of January in the plaintiff's handwriting and addressed to Mr. Del Valle at the inception of their acquaintance, which read, quote, "Should you deem it necessary to write to me, a line addressed to Miss Howard, care of J. Crank, 1060 First Avenue, will reach me." So, in anticipation of this testimony, Mr. Coati next interrogated the witness as follows. Did you ever go by any other name than your own father's name, Martínez, or your stepfather's name, Henriquez? I did not. Did you ever have letters left for you directed to Miss Howard, care of J. Crank, number 1060 First Avenue? I never did. Do you know number 1060 First Avenue? I do not. I have no idea where it is. Do you know what numbers on First Avenue are near to your house on 56th Street? I do not. I never went on First Avenue. Did you ever have any letters sent to you addressed to Miss Howard, care of Mrs. C. Nelson, on 9th Avenue? I never did. Here Mr. Coates again treads upon the toes of the witness's veracity, but it is difficult to see why he did not confront her then and there with her own letter. By adopting such a course, he took no chances whatever. He would have dealt her a serious blow in the eyes of the jury. Instead, Mr. Coates contents himself by putting this letter in evidence, while the defendant himself was on the witness stand, and the jury never really saw the point of it until the summing up, when their heads were so full of other things that this serious prevarication of the plaintiff probably went almost unnoticed. So he probably made a mistake here, is the suggestion. But okay, so Mr. Coates, at the meeting when Mr. Del Valle brought the ring to your house, as you say, was anybody present? Nobody was present. And I have forgotten how long you said it was that you kept the ring before returning it to him. I never told you any stated time. She's clever. Well, I would like to know now. I returned the ring to him when I dissolved the engagement between him and me, about a week or so after I had received the ring. Then it was only a week that the engagement lasted at first before it was resumed the second time? Well, I think so. The plaintiff had already read in evidence to the jury a fabricated copy of a letter breaking her engagement to the defendant and returning him the ring. No such letter had in fact been handed to Mr. Del Valle, but the plaintiff had substituted this alleged copy of a letter, the original of which Mr. Coates had in his possession, which was the one already referred to, wherein the plaintiff had complained of the brutal solicitations of her stepfather and had requested him not to read it until he was alone. Mr. Coates, now you have spoken of the circumstances upon which you returned him the ring in a letter with injunction not to open the letter until you separated. What was your purpose in requiring him not to open the letter until he should be out of your presence? Because I knew if I told him what my purpose was, he would not accept it. He would not dissolve the engagement between us, and I wished him to see that I was determined upon it. That was my purpose. Was not the fact of the ring being in the letter quite obvious from the outside? It was, and he asked me what it was. Where was it that you handed him that letter? When we were dining. At what place? Was it this place you have just mentioned, Solaris? Yes, sir. How many times have you been there, then? We went there after our engagement very frequently. Was that your regular place of meeting after your engagement? Sometimes we went to Delmonico's. More frequently we went to Solaris. And it was there that you handed him the letter? How long before going there had you written the letter? It was written the day after he spoke to me of having a compromise in Cuba. The very day after, I made up my mind to break the engagement. Tell me, if you please, tell me, if you please, all that he said when he spoke about this compromise. Well, we were coming home in a carriage, and he asked me when we should be married, and I told him I did not know, that I was not thinking of it yet for some time, and he said that when we should be married, he would like to be married privately without anybody knowing anything about it, that he had a good many friends here in New York, and the people were up to talk, and he requested me to marry him privately and at once. Did he say that he already had a wife as a compromise? No, he did not. Did he explain in any way what this compromise, as you call it, was? He merely told me, "Oh, there is no secrecy. I have a compromise in Cuba, some trouble there for reasons best known to myself, but that it was better to marry privately." Did you believe he had another wife living in Cuba? No. What was there that you suppose could prevent a man marrying again if he loved a woman, as he said he did you, except the existence of a wife already? Well, I thought perhaps he had some alliance with some other woman whom he had promised to marry or was obliged to marry, and could not marry any other woman under those circumstances. He did not suggest anything of that sort? That was only the impression that I received at the time, what I thought. And you never had any other impression but that, had you? No, I had not. When you concluded to take him again, it was under that impression? Not at all. He told me that the compromise was arranged and had been adjusted. I took him again and became engaged to him. Your idea of the nature of the compromise when you took him again was that he had been engaged to another woman in Cuba and promised to marry her. Is that it? Yes, sir, it was something of that kind. Then, when you concluded to take back the ring, it was upon the understanding that he had broken an engagement with a woman in Cuba. Did it not occur to you as an obstacle when you took him again that he had just broken a match with another woman? No, not at all. You did not care for that? No, I did not care for it because I trusted him. How often did Mr. Del Valle visit you at this time? 4 or 5 times a week. Did you and your mother keep these visits of this gentleman and the engagement a secret from your stepfather? We did. And that because of his threat to shoot you and the man, if you were ever married? Yes, sir. Had your father kept weapons ready? Well, no, I do not think he did. Did you ever make any complaint to Mr. Del Valle of being harshly treated by your stepfather? I never did. My father never treated me harshly. I want you to look at this signature and see whether that is yours on the paper now handed you. Passing paper to the witness. I could not say whether it is mine or not. Yes, but what is your opinion? I do not think it is. It does not look like my signature. Okay, then they go on about the copies and so on. Let me just go through to the more exciting part. Okay. As an explanation, all through his examination, Mr. Coati skipped from one subject to another and then, without any apparent reason, returned to the same subject again. This may have been intentional art on his part, or it may have been, as is so often the case in the excitement of a long trial, that new ideas occurred to him which brought him back to old subjects that had apparently already been exhausted. It would have been far more intelligible to the jury to have exhausted one subject at a time. It is asking too much of an ordinary juryman to shift his attention back and forth from one subject to another and expect him to catch all the points and carry clearly in his memory all that has been previously said on the subject. This mistake is almost unavoidable unless the cross-examination is thought out thoroughly in advance, which of course is sometimes impracticable, as perhaps in the instant case. It was part of the plaintiff's evidence that Mr. Del Valle had induced her to leave her home and go to the Hotel Royal under an assumed name until he could engage a house in the country where she could live as the governess of his children, pending their marriage, and on a salary of £100 a month. A note here, Mr. Coati cross-examined the plaintiff at length on this part of the case, and in his summing up explained, well, outlandish foreigners have done all sorts of things, and men have various ways of looking at the same thing, but here is a point, and here is a question at which I think there are no two ways of looking, and that is that it is contrary to the common instincts of mankind and a libel upon the common instincts of woman that when a betrothal has taken place between a fair and unsophisticated virgin and a man of any description, that in the interval between the betrothal and the wedding ceremony he should take her to his house and she should consent to go out upon a salary of $100 a month to serve in the capacity of a housekeeper. I leave the argument upon the point with you. But anyway, interrogation continues. Mr. Coati, now you say, Miss Martínez, that you went to the hotel on the 28th day of April. I did. From where did you go? From my own home. Did you know anybody at that hotel? I did not. Mr. Coati was prepared to show that the plaintiff was acquainted with the clerk of the Hotel Royal, a man by the name of Frederick Hammond, who on several occasions was seen by the bellboys in her room at the Hotel Royal, at which times the door of her bedroom was locked. The defendant's evidence subsequently showed also that many of the letters sent to the plaintiff under the name of Miss Howard and addressed to different letter boxes on First Avenue, etc., had on the envelope the monogram F.H., Frederick Hammond. Did you know any of the managers or the clerks at the Hotel Royal? I did not. Did you register your name at that hotel? I just merely gave my name as Miss Livingston. I did not register. I suppose I was registered. The name Miss Livingston registered on the hotel register was in the handwriting of this same Frederick Hammond. Mr. Coati, to whom did you give your name as Miss Livingston? To a gentleman whom I saw before taking board there. I went to arrange for a room the day before, and he asked me my name and showed me a room, and I told him my name was Miss Livingston, and he put it down. Who was that gentleman? I do not know who he was or what he was. Do you know a gentleman named Frederick Hammond? My receipts were signed that way, by the name of Hammond. Mr. Del Valle told me that he was acquainted with some of the managers of the hotel, and it was that hotel that he suggested my going to. You went there by his suggestion? Went by his suggestion to this hotel, yes. Did he tell you of Frederick Hammond? He did not. He merely said that he knew some of the managers. And you say that Hammond was the name signed to your receipt? Yes, sir. Was that the name of the gentleman to whom you gave your name as Miss Livingston? I really do not know. Was it anybody you had ever seen before? I had never seen the person before in my whole life. And you do not know how or by whom your name was registered in that hotel book? I do not know. The gentleman merely asked me my name, and I told him the room would suit me, and I would come the next day. And then you went alone both days. I did. And both times without the defendant. And you selected a room that suited you. I did, on the top floor. It was the only room that was available. It was shown later that this room was a very small size hall bedroom, and yet Miss Martínez was supposed to have made this arrangement with this hotel at the request of her wealthy affianced husband. In speaking of this, in his summing up, later on, Mr. Coates says, "That does not look like Mr. Del Valle's generous accommodations. Mr. Del Valle was profuse, lavish. She had the richest meats, the finest terrapin wines of her own choice, always at Solaris. But here, in a little 4x10 room in the 4th story of the Hotel Royal Y, gentlemen, that looks to me a little more like Frederick Hammond, who wrote her name in the hotel register." That does not look like... Oh, okay. So, sorry, I was reading it again. Mr. Coates continues, "Did the defendant select this name of Livingston for you?" "He merely told me to take an assumed name, to go under some other name, and I chose the name of Livingston." The purpose of this line of questions was shown in the summing up to have been as follows. "Now, gentlemen, you have all been married, I infer from your appearance." Laughter in the courtroom. "You have been through this mill of an engagement to be married. No matter what kind of a man he is, he may be as bad as men are ever made, or from that all the way to the next grade below the archangels, and I put it to you, on your judgment and common sense and your conscience, that you cannot find a man who would take the betrothed of his heart, the woman who he had chosen to be his wife, and the mother of his children, who would take her to a hotel in the city of New York to live for a longer or shorter period under an assumed name. The plaintiff went to this hotel by the name of Livingston. It was a good selection. She says Del Valle did not choose that name. She had already passed by the name under which she could claim the blood of all the Howards, but now she claimed alliance with the notable stock of Livingstones. Did you object to it when he told you to go there under an assumed name? No, I did not. You were entirely willing to go to a strange hotel alone under an assumed name. Yes, for a short while. I wish you would tell us again precisely what it was that induced you to go to this strange hotel under such circumstances. Well, Mr. Del Valle suggested that perhaps it would be better for me. He did not wish to have any trouble with my stepfather concerning my disappearance, neither did I wish to give him any unnecessary trouble if my father should take any violent steps of any kind, as he had so often threatened to do, and he suggested that I should take a room somewhere at some hotel and see how Papa would act. How was Papa to know anything about it if you were under an assumed name? Well, he certainly would know something about it when I left home. And the plan was that he should know about it? Should know what? Should know that you had gone? Why, of course. To this hotel? No, not to the hotel. He knew that I had left home, and my fear was that he would hire detectives to search for me, and of course, if he discovered me in Mr. Del Valle's home, I could not answer for the consequences. What consequences did you apprehend? I apprehended that he would kill Mr. Del Valle and kill me. And rather than that, you were willing to go to this hotel in this manner. Certainly, Mr. Del Valle suggested it. Do you know whether your father did do anything because of your leaving? Yes, I know that he put a personal in the Herald for me. Did you show this personal to Mr. Del Valle? I showed it to him. Did you discover it in the Herald? I did. The personal in the Herald of the 2nd day of May, or about 5 days after you had reached the hotel, is contained in this paper which I now show you, isn't it? Yes. Now, after the 2nd day of May, therefore, you knew that this personal had come from your father, didn't you? I did. After you knew that your father was inconsolable and would make all satisfactory, you did not have any more fear of his shooting you or Mr. Del Valle either, did you? I most certainly did. My father was not to be relied upon in what he said at all. He said a great many things which he never meant. Do you mean that he did not have a good reputation for veracity? Not at all, but I knew that he had always threatened to shoot me and my husband if I ever had done, and I knew that he would not make all satisfactory, and that is why I did not return home. Did you answer this personal? I did not. Did you take any notice of your unhappy father? I did not. Make no effort to console him? I did not. I love Mr. Del Valle and went with Mr. Del Valle and trusted him. I had nothing to do with my father. My father had many others to console him. While you were at the Hotel Royal, did you make a visit to the Central Park with Mr. Del Valle? Yes, frequently we went up to the park and walked all around. It was the only chance I had of going out when he took me up there. Do you remember anything you told him at that time? Nothing in particular. Did you tell him that your stepfather had been using you brutally? I did not. I never told him any such thing. Did you say that you had to leave home and go to the hotel because of the bad treatment of your stepfather? I never did tell him so. Did you ever tell anybody that? I could never tell anyone so, because my stepfather never treated me badly. Later in the trial, Mrs. Quackenbos testified on the part of the defendant that while she was visiting Mr. Del Valle's summer house at Poughkeepsie, she was introduced to the plaintiff as Miss Enriquez, the housekeeper, and that during the conversation that followed, she expressed her surprise at seeing so young a lady in that position, whereupon the plaintiff had replied that she had a mystery attached to her life which she would tell Mrs. Quackenbos, and perhaps she would then think differently. She testified that the plaintiff had told her that her mother had married her uncle and that she lived very unhappily at home owing to her stepfather's constant overtures to her, that her stepfather was enamored of her, that the plaintiff, in making this confession, had used these words, quote, "That is why I am here, madam. My mamma asked Mr. Del Valle to take me from my home." The plaintiff told Mrs. Quackenbos that it was impossible for her to remain at home, that she was almost exhausted from fighting for her honor, and that her mother had begged Mr. Del Valle to take her away. In speaking of this evidence in the summing up, Mr. Coates said, "Why," she said, "gentlemen, why? That she had been driven from her home by the amorous persecutions of her stepfather, and that her mother had besought Mr. Del Valle to take her to his house as his governess and housekeeper. You can't rub that out, gentlemen, if you dance on it all night with India rubber shoes." When was it that the arrangements were completed and the family moved to the summer house in Poughkeepsie? The 1st of June. Did you go direct to Poughkeepsie with Mr. Del Valle and his children? I did. Now, I understand you that until the end of the first week of your stay at Mr. Del Valle's home in Poughkeepsie, that is, until this 6th of June, which you have spoken about, and from the 14th of January, when you first made Mr. Del Valle's acquaintance, he was uniformly kind and courteous. Always. And there was not the least symptom of impropriety in his conduct towards you. Never, sir. He never offered me the slightest indignity on any occasion. And no approach toward impropriety on his part? Never, not on any single occasion, not a breath of it. And to this occurrence of the 6th of June, I understand you to say that after breakfast you went up to your room and lay down. I did. And I understand you to say that was your usual habit. Yes, sir, it was not an everyday habit, it was more of a Sunday habit. What time of the day did you have breakfast on that Sunday? At 11 o'clock in the morning. How do you fix the date? I think it is a day in a woman's life that she can never forget. and you fix it as your first Sunday in Poughkeepsie. I do. Who were the members of the household at that time on that day? Who were they besides yourself and Mr. Del Valle? There were the 2 younger children, Mr. Alvarez, and the servants. How many servants were there? There were 7 servants. And your room was there? Your room was where? My room was on the same floor with the family and Mr. Del Valle's and the children's, and next to the nurse and the 2 younger children, all children, in fact. Now, at breakfast, who were present that morning? The children, Mr. Alvarez, Mr. Del Valle, and myself. What time was it you finished breakfast? About 11:30 or 11:45, perhaps 12 o'clock, I do not remember. And how soon after you had finished breakfast did you go to your room? Immediately after. Did you go alone? I did. What did you do? I lay on my bed reading. I could hear the children downstairs. They were on the veranda. I heard their voices as they went away from the house with the nurse. You remained on your bed, did you? I did. I was interested in my book and I commenced to read. Did you remain upon the bed from the time you first took your place upon it until Mr. Del Valle had accomplished what you charged upon him yesterday? I did, and were not off the bed at all. I was not. I had partially arisen when he entered. The door of your room opened into the center of the house, did it not? It did. Did you close the door? I did. Did you lock it? I did not. Did you hear any other sound before Mr. Del Valle appeared in your room? I did not, merely the children's receding voices in the distance. This was a warm summer day, was it not? It was, the 6th of June. Were the windows open? Yes. Did Mr. Del Valle knock upon the door? He did not. You heard the door open? I did. You saw him enter? I did. And were you lying upon the bed? I was. Did you get up from the bed? I just attempted to rise. Who prevented you? He came over to me and sat down on the side of the bed. Did he shut the door? He did. While he was doing that, did you attempt to rise? I did. Why didn't you rise? Because I could not. He came over to me before I had partially risen. Do you mean to say that in the time of his coming in and presenting himself and opening and shutting the door, there was not time for you to spring up from the bed? There was not, because he was already half in the room before I heard that he was in. I was engaged in reading at the time, and he had opened the door very softly. Was there time for you to begin to start from the bed? Well, I do not know. I did not study the time. How long was he in your room that morning? I cannot say exactly. You can say whether he was there an hour or 2 hours or half an hour. Well, he was there about an hour. Did you make an outcry while he was in the room? No, I did not scream. Did not attempt to scream, did you? No, I did not attempt to scream. I remonstrated with him. Did you speak in a loud voice? Well, not to be heard all over the house, but if anybody had been in the room, he would have heard me. Did you speak low? Lower than I am speaking now. You did not make any effort to make yourself heard by anybody in the house or outside. No, I was not afraid of Mr. Del Valle. I did not think he came into my room to murder me, nor hurt me, nor anything. You found out, according to your story, what he did come for after a while, didn't you? Yes. And before he accomplished his purpose. Yes. Now, didn't you speak above a low voice then? Well, perhaps I did. Well, did you? I think I did. Well, did you scream out? I did not. Did you call out? I did not. Did you speak loud enough to be heard by any of the servants below or anybody in the hall or on the veranda? I do not think anybody could have heard me. Why didn't you cry out? Because he told me not to. Oh, he told you not to. Yes. Then it was a spirit of obedience to him. Just as you please to look upon it. Just as I please to look upon it, well, I look upon it so. Now you say that you do not think he had any evil purpose when he came into the room. No, I cannot believe he did. And you do not think so now? Oh, I do think so now, certainly. You did not think so then? No, I did not when he entered the room. There was nothing indicating an evil purpose on his part? No, I do not think so. How long had he been there before there was anything on his part that indicated to you any evil intent? About 15 minutes. Before you had the least idea of any evil intent on his part? Well, I did not then think that he had any evil intent. Were you fully dressed that morning? Fully dressed. And fully dressed when he came into the room? Fully dressed. Just as you had been at breakfast? Just the very same. And you were lying on the bed. Where was he? He was also on the bed. Sitting by your side? Yes. And you and he were engaged in conversation, were you? We were. Sometime during that hour you became partly undressed, I suppose. When was that? How do you know I became partly undressed? I judge so from what you have stated before. I beg your pardon. Did you or did you not? No, I did not become undressed. Merely Mr. Del Valle took my belt off. I had a wrapper on. I had a black silk belt. You had a belt. How was that secured? Just merely by hook and eye. It was a black silk ribbon belt. And that became unhooked. It did not become unhooked. Mr. Del Valle unhooked it. What was it you did when he unhooked the belt? Did you cry out? No, I did not cry out. I told you I made no outcry whatever. In this part, Mr. Guati had made his point. Immediately, the idea flashed across his mind that if he stopped here, he had one of the opportunities of his life for the summing up. This is how he made use of it in the summing up. Gentlemen of the jury, this is not a story of Lucretia and Tarquin who came with his sword. Oh no, there was not any sword here. They conversed together. There is not a word as to what was said, and after a while the story is he unbuckled her belt, and then it was all over. On the unloosening of her belt, she went all to pieces. Gentlemen, my question to you, which I want you to take to the jury room and answer, is whether, under such circumstances, by the mere undoing of that hook and eye, and the unloosening of that belt, a woman would go all to pieces unless there was something on a very loose woman behind the belt. All the household was there. Why did she not cry out? Why did she not raise that gentle-tempered voice of hers a little? A silent seduction by her own story. But let's finish with it. Mr. Guati. Now, Miss Martínez, you have spoken of your father, this is touching on another point, being sometime or other informed of your having gone to Poughkeepsie. And did you also understand that he was informed of your project of marriage? Yes, sir, he was. Did he come up with his revolver? He did not. Did he make any effort to see you? No, he did not. Did he make any effort to see Mr. Del Valle? He did not. He appeared at Poughkeepsie after a while, did he not? Yes, he did. My mother revealed the fact to him that I was at Poughkeepsie and engaged to be married to Mr. Del Valle, and insisted upon his acting reasonably. And he did act reasonably, did he not? He did. He came up making visits. He did. Was Mr. Del Valle at home? He was. And you were there? I was. Did you see the meeting between your father and Mr. Del Valle? I did. I introduced my father to Mr. Del Valle. Everything was agreeable and pleasant, was it? Very pleasant indeed. And your father stayed to dinner? He did. Did he make any threats? He did not. Did he exhibit any violence? He did not. Then all your fears proved to have been unfounded, didn't they? Not at all. You think that, after all, if you had married Mr. Del Valle, he would have carried his threats into execution. I think he would, most certainly. And yet he came up pleasantly and spent the day with Mr. Del Valle and you at Mr. Del Valle's house, knowing that you were living in his house. Yes. Upon a promise of marriage. He did. Did he try to dissuade you from marrying? He did not. And yet you think that if you married, he would have shot you and Mr. Del Valle. I do most certainly think so. Let me see how much more.
There is quite a bit more, so I think I will leave it for another time. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.